The solicitor's office smelled of leather and dust, the scent of old money pretending it hadn't rotted from the inside. Evangeline sat rigid in the mahogany chair, her fingers twisted in her lap, her pregnancy unmistakable beneath the black maternity dress she'd borrowed from her sister. 3 months ago, she'd been assistant curator at the British Museum. 3 months ago, her life had made sense. Now she was unemployed, abandoned, and drowning in medical bills. "Your great-aunt Margaret passed without issue or direct heirs," Mr. Pemberton said, adjusting his spectacles. His voice carried the practiced monotone of a man who had delivered this speech 100 times. The entailment was complex, but blood claims supersede all complications. As her nearest living relative, despite the circumstances of your current situation, you are the sole beneficiary of Blackthorn Manor and its grounds. The estate is substantial. Evangeline's head lifted. "I don't understand. She never acknowledged me. My mother said Aunt Margot was estranged from the family for decades." "Indeed." Pemberton slid a folder across the desk. "The will is explicit. She left instructions that should you ever be in need, the manor was to be yours. She was quite specific about that." In need, her words. How had Aunt Margot known? How had she known that Evangeline would be fired when her pregnancy became visible? That Richard would evaporate like morning fog, leaving her with nothing but medical paperwork and rent notices. "The manor has been closed for some years," Pemberton continued. "Staff departed approximately 20 years ago. There may be structural concerns, electrical systems, the usual deteriorations. However, the grounds are extensive and the property value alone. Can I move in?" Evangeline interrupted, her voice small. "Tonight." Pemberton blinked. "I beg your pardon. I'm currently staying with my sister. Her husband doesn't want me there. I have nowhere else, Mr. Pemberton. Can I move into the manor?" He hesitated, consulting a document. "The manor is in Yorkshire, rather isolated, and as I mentioned, it's been abandoned." "I don't care." The solicitor exchanged a look with his junior clerk. "Very well. I'll arrange for the keys to be transferred and have a surveyor meet you there within the week." Prudent, given the circumstances. The Yorkshire moors revealed themselves in shades of violet and grey as Evangeline's hired car climbed toward Blackthorn Manor. December's dying light hung above the landscape like a held breath. She pressed her palm against the cold window, feeling the child move beneath her ribs. A small flutter of protest at her racing heartbeat. The manor emerged from the mist like something remembered from a nightmare. Gothic revival architecture sprawled across the hillside, all blackened stone, pointed arches, and windows like hollow eyes. Ivy choked the eastern wing. The gatehouse had collapsed into a heap of rubble and weather-worn brick. What should have been gardens had become a tangle of thorns and gnarled trees, twisted into shapes that seemed almost intentional, almost hostile. "Bloody hell," the driver muttered, pulling to a stop before the iron-strapped doors. "Miss, are you certain about this?" Evangeline gathered her coat around her expanding belly. "Certain as I can be." The keys were cold in her hand. 3 ancient iron keys that looked like they'd been forged in another century. The first opened the great doors with a shriek of hinges that echoed across the hills. The smell hit her first stone, candle wax, and something else. Something like copper and time. Inside, the manor was a cathedral to abandonment. Sheets-draped furniture like funeral shrouds. Portraits lined the walls, their subjects' eyes tracking her as she moved through the entrance hall. A chandelier hung from the ceiling like a skeletal hand, its crystals dulled with years of undisturbed dust. Evangeline climbed the grand staircase, one hand trailing the banister. Her breath fogged the cold air. It shouldn't have been this cold. Even abandoned houses retained some warmth, some sense of previous habitation. This felt preserved. Kept, she found the master bedroom on the 2nd floor, a cavernous space dominated by a 4-poster bed draped in burgundy velvet. The mirrors reflected her exhausted face back at her a dozen times over. She looked like a ghost, pale and hollow-eyed, her dark hair stringy with travel. It was the door beneath the bed's ornate headboard that caught her attention. A small door, almost hidden, with a symbol carved into its frame. A crescent moon intersected by a thorned rose. Evangeline knelt to examine it, her belly pressing uncomfortably against her thighs. The door was locked, but beside it lay a 4th key she hadn't noticed before. It must have been in the key case, buried beneath the others. This key was different, silver instead of iron, warm to the touch despite the manor's chill. The lock turned smoothly, as though it had been oiled yesterday. Candlelight bloomed beneath the door like a sudden breath. Evangeline stumbled back, her heart hammering. But the light remained steady, dozens of candles, arranged in deliberate patterns, illuminating stone steps descending into darkness. And carved above the threshold, the same symbol moon and thorned rose, repeated over and over. She should have closed the door. Should have locked it, boarded it. Never thought of it again. Instead, she descended. The crypt beneath Blackthorn Manor was larger than the manor itself seemed to allow. Impossible, but there it was, vaulted ceilings supported by columns carved to resemble twisted thorns. Tombs lined the walls, stone sepulchres with names carved too worn to read. The candles burned without flickering, their light casting everything in shades of amber and shadow. At the far end of the crypt stood an altar. Not a Christian altar, this one bore the same symbol moon and rose, and before it, on a stone dais, lay a figure wrapped in fabric so ancient it had nearly returned to dust. Evangeline's feet carried her forward of their own accord. She couldn't feel them moving. The world had narrowed to the sound of her own breathing, the pressure of the baby against her ribs, and a sound she only half heard, something like singing, or like sorrow given voice. She reached out to touch the fabric. The figure moved, not suddenly, slowly, with the terrible inevitability of a monument shifting after centuries of stillness. The wrappings fell away like petals, and she saw him, pale skin, dark hair, eyes the color of storm, dark water. Beautiful and terrible and wrong in every way that mattered. He looked at her, and she saw the hunger there, the kind of hunger that transcended centuries. "She sent you," he said, his voice like the scrape of ancient stone. "After all this time, she finally sent you." Evangeline tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Behind the hunger in his eyes, she saw something else. A glimpse of immortal sorrow so profound that her knees weakened. "Don't be afraid," he whispered, and it was the worst thing he could have said, because some part of her, the part that had been abandoned and broken, and was carrying a child into a world that didn't want her, recognized something in that sorrow. Some part of her understood it perfectly. Evangeline's scream caught in her throat, crystallizing into silence. The figure before her didn't move, didn't lunge or snarl or transform into the thing nightmares were made of. He simply watched her with those storm-dark eyes, and slowly, as though it pained him, he sat up. The ancient wrappings fell away completely, revealing a man in a state of undress that should have terrified her more than the impossibility of his existence. It didn't. "Your heart is racing," he said softly, tilting his head as if listening to something beyond human perception. "Not from fear. From something else. You're—" Evangeline's hand flew to her belly protectively. "What are you?" "Damned." He stood with fluid grace, and she saw the full terrible beauty of him now, tall, broad-shouldered, with skin that seemed to drink in the candlelight rather than reflect it. His clothes materialized around him from shadows, fabric that looked like it belonged to another century. "The question you should ask is, what are you? Why can you stand here, in this place of binding, and not scream?" "I don't know." Her voice trembled. "I inherited Blackthorn Manor, yes. Because your great-aunt was a woman of extraordinary foresight." He moved toward the altar, his fingers trailing across ancient stone. "Margot understood what I am, what I have become, and she understood, I think, what you might become." Evangeline's legs felt unreliable. She backed toward the stone steps, but his gaze held her more effectively than chains. "My aunt was a recluse. She never left her cottage in Devon. How could she possibly? How could she know about the cursed Lord of Blackthorn?" A shadow of something that might have been a smile crossed his face. "Because she was one of the few mortals who understood the nature of the curse. Blood calls to blood, Miss Evangeline. Always. How do you know my name? It's written in the manor's stones, in every threshold, every candlelit corner. Your name has echoed through these halls for 2 centuries, waiting to be spoken aloud." He turned to face her fully now, and the candlelight caught something sharp in his expression. "Margot left you the manor as protection, and as invitation. She knew you would need shelter. She knew you would come here desperate, alone, carrying—" His eyes dropped to her belly, carrying new life into a world that would devour it without hesitation. "Stop." Evangeline held up her hand. "This is insane. I'm tired, I'm emotional, and I'm probably hallucinating. Sleep deprivation, stress, hormones. You believe in rationality, then? Excellent. Observe." He extended his hand, palm up. The candlelight caught the fine lines there, and for just a moment she saw his skin shimmer, translucent, revealing the shadow of something beneath, not bone, something older, something other. "I am a daywalker cursed to feed on blood, yet forbidden the sun's touch. I cannot cross running water. I cannot enter a home uninvited. I cannot take a human life without suffering centuries of agony that would shatter your sanity to witness. I have existed for 417 years within these walls, bound by a covenant made in blood and sorrow. The hand dropped. The shimmer faded. The curse prevents me from leaving. Evangeline whispered. The curse prevents me from wanting to leave anymore. His voice carried the weight of centuries. I stopped wanting that approximately 300 years ago. When I accepted what I was and ceased fighting it, she should have run. Should have fled up those stone steps and out of the manor and into the Yorkshire night, never looking back. Instead, she found herself asking, why does my presence feel like an echo? His eyes closed briefly. When they opened again, they held something raw. Because you carry the blood of the woman who bound me here. Margot was my only friend in the last century of my isolation. She knew what my touch could do, that I am poison to mortal flesh, that my very proximity drains the life force from those around me. Yet she sat with me anyway. Here in this crypt, every new moon for 53 years she came. She was dying. Evangeline said suddenly, though she didn't know how she knew. When she stopped visiting, that's when the servants left. She was not dying. She was transforming. He moved toward her again, and this time she didn't retreat. She was choosing a different kind of immortality. Not of body, but of blood memory. Everything she was, she poured into the bloodline. Into you, her great niece. So that when you came to Blackthorn, if you came to Blackthorn, there would be a bridge between us. Evangeline's hand trembled as she touched her belly. The baby moved again, stronger this time. A kick, deliberate and present. The child will be safe here, protected by the very magic that contains me. His voice carried a strange tenderness now, layered with something darker underneath. But you must understand what that means. The manor will bond with the child's blood. The covenant will recognize the next generation, and you. He paused, studying her face as though reading something written in invisible ink across her skin. You are caught between what was and what must be. Stop speaking in riddles. I will speak plainly, then, though the words will terrify you more than mystery ever could. He stepped closer, and she caught a scent like old stone and winter rain and something underneath, copper and roses. My touch brings death to mortals. I cannot feed without causing suffering. I have been solitary for so long that human contact sends me into a hunger that takes months to subside. And yet, his hand lifted, trembling slightly, as though moving against tremendous resistance. Yet my blood calls to yours and yours sings in response. Margot ensured that you would be immune. That you would be the one exception to the curse that defines me. Immune. Evangeline breathed. You could touch me, he said, and live. You could take my blood into your body and survive it. More than survive, you would be transformed by it. Made stronger. Made eternal if you chose that path. Her hand rose of its own accord. She watched it move detached from her conscious will, as though the manor itself was guiding her fingers toward his face. She could see the pulse of him now, beneath the pale skin of his throat. A shadow of life, force that shouldn't have existed in a creature long dead. What is your name? She whispered. Tacius Valdris. Prince of nothing. Lord of only this damned ground. He didn't move as her fingers came to rest against his cheek. Cold, impossibly cold, but not repellent. Magnetic. And you are Evangeline Thorne, inheritor of secrets, carrier of both curse and salvation. The moment her skin touched his, the candles flared brilliant white. Evangeline gasped, and for just an instant, she saw through his eyes, centuries of loneliness, darkness beyond measure, and beneath it all, a desperate, aching hope that this moment was real. That she was real. That he was no longer alone. Then the vision shattered, and she found herself on her knees, Cassius's hands hovering above her, not touching, never quite touching, his entire body rigid with the effort of restraint. You must go, he said hoarsely. You must leave this crypt and rest. Because if you stay longer, I fear I will not have the strength to let you go. Evangeline didn't sleep. She lay in the master bedroom, surrounded by the manor's ancient darkness, listening to the wind howl across the moors. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt his touch, cold and electric and impossibly real. When dawn finally broke gray and reluctant over the Yorkshire hills, she rose without having rested, her body aching with exhaustion and something else. Something that felt like hunger. Though she'd eaten nothing since arriving, the manor revealed itself differently in daylight. Less threatening, perhaps, but infinitely more mysterious. Sunlight filtered through dust-laden windows, illuminating forgotten corners and casting long shadows from furniture that had been draped and waiting for 2 centuries. She moved through the halls like a ghost, her hand trailing the banister, her footsteps echoing across polished wood. The library was on the 3rd floor. a room she hadn't noticed the previous night. Tall windows overlooked the moors, and shelves rose toward a vaulted ceiling, packed with volumes that seemed to span centuries. Many were in languages she didn't recognize: Latin, Greek, something that looked like Old French. She pulled down a leather-bound journal at random. The handwriting was elegant, precise, dated 1642. The blood remembers what the mind forgets. Today I felt it, the stirring of something ancient beneath my skin. Mother says it is merely hysteria, but I know better. The women of Blackthorn have always carried the gift, the sight, the connection to the old magic. I fear what it means that I can feel Ham now, in the crypts beneath the manor. Calling across the years, Evangeline's breath caught. She replaced the journal carefully and selected another, this one dated 1891. Margot came to see me today. She is young still. Barely 20, but she carries the same gift I do. She asked about the cursed lord, about the nature of his binding. I told her what my grandmother told me, that he was a man once, noble and good, until love betrayed him into darkness. The curse is not one of teeth and hunger, but of isolation. He is locked away not by chains, but by the very magic his own blood created. He cannot leave without destroying himself. And we, the women of Blackthorn, we are bound to maintain the covenant, to ensure he never breaks it. This is our burden and our honor. Evangeline sank into an old wingback chair, the journal trembling in her hands. How many generations had known? How many women in her family had walked these halls, carrying knowledge she'd never inherited until yesterday? A sound drifted from below, not the wind, but something like music. A violin, played with such exquisite melancholy that her chest ached with the weight of it. She followed the sound like a compass finding north, descending the stairs and moving through the manor's lower corridors, toward a door she hadn't noticed before. It was slightly ajar, candlelight spilling through the crack. The music room was small, intimate, lined with instruments covered in dust. Cassius stood near the far window, his back to her, drawing a bow across strings that sang beneath his fingers. He wore no coat this time, only a linen shirt that hung loose on his pale frame. In the weak daylight, she could see the outline of him more clearly, the stark lines of his shoulders, the graceful curve of his spine. He didn't stop playing when she entered. If anything, the melody grew deeper, more mournful. "You shouldn't be here," he said without turning around. "The daylight weakens my control. Being near you in daylight is dangerous." "For whom?" Evangeline moved closer. The music seemed to pull her forward, note by note. "For me or for you?" He finally turned, the violin lowering. His eyes were darker than they'd been in candlelight, ringed with something that looked like pain. "For both of us, but primarily for me. Because every moment I look at you, I feel the hunger deepening. And knowing that you are immune, that I could feed and not destroy you, that knowledge is becoming unbearable." "Then feed," she said simply. The violin fell from his hands. It caught on the edge of a chair, the strings crying out in a discordant wail before it clattered to the floor. "You don't understand what you're asking. Then make me understand." Evangeline stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. She could feel the cold radiating from him now, a chill that should have driven her away but instead drew her in. "Make me understand, Cassius. Tell me why my great-aunt chose this. Why she arranged for me to come here. Why I can feel you calling even when you're not in the room." He turned away, his hands gripping the windowsill. "Because you are the key to my salvation or my damnation, and Margot believed I deserved the chance to choose which one." "Choose, then." "It's not that simple." "It is." She reached out and touched his shoulder. The moment her skin met his shirt, his entire body went rigid. "I'm standing here. I'm not running. I'm not screaming. Whatever you are, whatever hunger you carry, I'm not afraid of it. You should be." He turned to face her, and she saw it now, the edges of something monstrous lurking beneath his skin. His eyes had begun to shift, the pupils elongating. The irises flooding with red. The hunger isn't civilized, Evangeline. It doesn't follow the rules of courtesy or restraint. When it takes hold, I am barely myself. I am only appetite and need and the desperate, animal drive to consume. "Then maybe," she whispered, "I need to be consumed." She didn't know where the courage came from. Perhaps from desperation. Perhaps from the knowledge that her body was already changing. Pregnancy had made her a stranger to herself. Perhaps from the simple fact that for the first time since Richard had abandoned her, she felt wanted. Not in spite of her condition, but because of it. Because of the blood in her veins and the life growing in her womb and the centuries, old magic that recognized her as kin. Cassius's hand rose slowly, as though moving through water. His fingers trembled as they brushed her cheek. Where he touched her, her skin burned, not with pain, but with sensation so intense it blurred the line between agony and ecstasy. "If I take what I need," he said hoarsely, "there will be no going back. The blood bond will begin to form. You will start to change. The manor will recognize you as more than a resident. You will become tied to this place, to me, eternally." "I already am?" She tilted her head, exposing the delicate curve of her throat. "I felt it the moment you looked at me in the crypt. Margot made sure I would. She bound me to you across generations, didn't she?" "Yes." His breathing had become ragged now, his fangs extending with an audible click. "Forgive me?" He moved with impossible speed, his mouth finding her throat, his hands gripping her waist. For a moment there was pain, sharp, searing, and then something else. Something like rapture. She felt the drawing sensation as he fed, felt her blood flowing into him like a river finding its course. But it didn't weaken her. Instead, with each pulse of her heart, she felt herself growing stronger, clearer, more alive than she'd ever been, and beneath the physical sensation, something deeper stirred. She felt his memories like lightning through her veins, centuries of loneliness, the sweetness of Margot's friendship, the crushing weight of isolation, and underneath it all, a desperate, aching need to be known, to be loved, to be saved. When he finally pulled away, his eyes had cleared. The monstrous hunger was sated, replaced by something almost like peace. "The blood bond has begun," he whispered against her throat. "Can you feel it?" She could. It thrummed through her like a second heartbeat, connecting her to him across a distance that suddenly seemed meaningless. Two broken things, bound together by centuries of magic and desperate hope. "What happens now?" she asked. Cassius looked down at her, his pale hands resting gently on the small of her back, careful not to disturb the child. "Now," he said softly, "we begin the work of saving each other. Or we destroy each other entirely." The manor seemed to hold its breath around them, waiting to see which it would be. 3 days passed in a strange suspension between worlds. Evangeline moved through Blackthorn Manor like a woman caught between waking and dreaming. The blood bond thrummed beneath her skin constantly now, a second pulse that synchronized with Cassius's presence. When he was near, which was increasingly often as the days shortened toward winter, she felt it like a string drawn taut. When he retreated to the crypts during the day, it ached like a phantom limb. The changes were subtle at first. Her skin took on a luminescence that hadn't been there before, as though moonlight lived just beneath the surface. Her senses sharpened until she could hear the heartbeat of mice in the manor's walls, smell the copper, rich petrichor of rain on stone before it touched the ground. Most strangely, she no longer felt hunger in the conventional sense. Food turned to ash in her mouth. But blood, the scent of blood called to something primal awakening in her chest. It was this last change that frightened her most. She was in the library when the nosebleed came, sudden, violent, a gush of blood that stained the pages of an 18th century text on blood magic. She pressed her hand to her face, watching the crimson droplets fall like tears onto the ancient paper. The smell of it made her dizzy with a need she didn't have a name for. "Don't." Cassius's voice came from the doorway. He'd moved so silently she hadn't heard him enter. "Don't touch the blood." "Not yet. You're not ready. I don't understand what's happening to me." Evangeline's voice broke. "I'm changing. Every hour, something else is different. My body doesn't feel like mine anymore." He crossed the room and gently took her hand, using a handkerchief to stanch the bleeding. His touch was careful now, no longer cold. Since the feeding, his skin had warmed slightly, as though her blood had awakened something dormant in his veins. "The bond is accelerating your transformation," he said quietly. "It should have taken months. Years, perhaps. But Margot's bloodline carries the gift of swift integration. Your body recognizes what it's becoming and races to meet it." "What am I becoming?" He led her away from the library, down through the manor's lower levels, past the master bedroom, to a part of the house she hadn't explored. A study, lined with mirrors and peculiar instruments, some that looked like medical equipment from another era, others she couldn't identify at all. On the walls, dozens of journals were arranged chronologically, each spine labeled with a date and a name. Cassius Valdris, 1602, present. "Sit," he commanded gently, and she obeyed, settling into a chair before the largest mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, and she barely recognized herself. Her eyes had taken on a faint luminescence, their pupils vertical now, responsive to something beyond normal light. Her cheekbones had become sharper, more pronounced. And her lips. Her lips held the faint stain of something that might have been blood. "I'm becoming like you," she whispered. "No." He stood behind her, his hands resting on the back of the chair. "You're becoming something new. Something that has never existed before. The union of a cursed immortal and a bloodline bearer. The ceremony that created me was designed to bind a man into eternal servitude. But you carry the blood of those who created the binding itself. That changes everything. Tell me," Evangeline demanded. "Tell me what I need to know." Cassius moved to one of his journals and withdrew a aged leather book, its pages brittle with centuries. He opened it carefully, revealing handwritten passages in a script she somehow understood despite having never seen it before. Another gift of the blood bond, perhaps. "In 1602, he began, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "I was a prince of a small kingdom in what is now Romania. I was good, or so I believed. I served the church. I loved a woman named Isabeau with all the purity a young man can muster, and I believed myself destined for greatness." He turned the page, revealing a portrait sketched in charcoal. A young man's face, beautiful and noble, with eyes that held both kindness and terrible naivete. Isabeau was promised to another, a political alliance her father had arranged. We were forbidden from even speaking to each other. But we loved each other with the kind of love that burns through all reason. His voice had taken on a quality of distant grief. "We met in secret. One night, in the catacombs beneath the cathedral, we made a covenant. We took each other's blood, a sacred act in the old traditions. We believed that if our blood mingled, no earthly power could separate us." "What happened?" Evangeline asked, though she sensed she wouldn't like the answer. "Betrayal." The word fell like a stone. "Isabeau's father discovered our affair. He was a powerful man, connected to the old magic. He decided that if we loved each other so desperately, we should have eternity together, but twisted. Corrupted. He performed a ritual in those same catacombs where we'd spoken our vows. He took my blood, our mingled blood, and poured it into a chalice inscribed with binding runes. He spoke words I didn't understand, and I felt something fundamental tear inside me." Cassius's hand moved to his chest, as though he could still feel that ancient wound. "I became this. The hunger, the inability to die, the curse that touches all living things, all of it was designed as punishment. But the cruelest part was the binding itself. I couldn't leave the place where the ritual occurred. I was locked into Blackthorn Manor, the ancestral seat of Isabeau's family, forced to exist in the same spaces where she had lived, where her descendants continued the line, never able to touch them without bringing suffering." "Isabeau," Evangeline started, "married as planned, lived a conventional life, bore children and grandchildren and eventually died of old age. Never knowing that I'd felt every moment of her happiness from within these walls, that I'd borne witness to her joy and her sorrow and her eventual peace with the life she'd been given." His voice cracked slightly. "The cruelest gift. Consciousness enough to understand what I'd lost, but not enough to move beyond it." Evangeline rose from the chair and turned to face him. "How did you survive it?" "I didn't, for a very long time. Not truly. For 3 centuries, I existed in a state that was barely life. I fed when I had to, mostly on animals brought to the manor as tribute. I read everything I could reach, trying to understand the magic that held me. I learned that the binding was designed to break only under 2 conditions. If the bloodline produced a descendant who could willingly take the curse upon themselves, or if the one who cast it renounced the magic themselves." "Isabeau's descendants," Evangeline said slowly. "The women of Blackthorn. That's why they protected me, studied the magic. Eventually, Margot realized something the others hadn't. She traced the genealogy and discovered that the bloodline of the woman who cast the curse had merged with Isabeau's line generations ago. She learned that somewhere in that intermingled blood, there existed the possibility of someone who could break the binding willingly. Someone who could choose, without coercion or pain, to accept what I was." He reached out, his fingers finding her chin, tilting her face up toward the mirror. "Someone like you, Evangeline. Your nosebleed, it's not a symptom of illness. It's the blood recognizing its own nature. The transformation your body is undergoing isn't slavery. It's awakening." "Awakening to what?" she whispered. "To the choice Margot spent her life ensuring you would have." His eyes met hers in the mirror, and she saw the hope there, desperate, fragile, dangerous. "You're becoming what I once was, human enough to feel, immortal enough to endure. And if you choose, when the blood bond reaches its completion, you can break the curse entirely." "Be doing what?" His reflection smiled sadly. "By loving me. Truly, completely, without reservation or fear. By binding yourself to me not through magic but through choice." Margot believed that the curse was never meant to be eternal, that it was designed to be broken by love strong enough to transcend it. Evangeline's hand moved to her belly, where the baby kicked in response to her racing heartbeat. "And if I choose not to, then you remain in transformation indefinitely," he said quietly, caught between mortality and immortality. "Neither fully one nor the other. Eventually the choice will be forced upon you, by the baby's birth, or by circumstances neither of us can control. But it should be your choice, Evangeline, never mine." The manor creaked around them as though listening. Outside, snow had begun to fall on the Yorkshire moors, and somewhere in the crypts beneath their feet, ancient magic hummed with anticipation. The hunters came on the winter solstice. Evangeline didn't see them arrive, she felt them. The blood bond had become so sensitive now that she could sense disturbance in the manor's ancient magic like ripples across still water. She was in the conservatory, attempting to coax life back into Blackthorn's overgrown gardens, when the sensation hit her sharp, discordant, like nails scraping across glass. Danger. She found Cassius in the library, standing perfectly still before one of the tall windows. He was dressed differently than she'd ever seen him, not in the soft linens and velvet he favored indoors, but in armor. Actual armor, blackened steel that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He looked like something from another age entirely, a warrior dragged reluctantly into the present. "They've been circling for 3 days," he said without turning. "I've been waiting to see if they'd work up the courage to approach. It seems they have." "Ooh." Evangeline moved to stand beside him, pressing her hand against the cold glass. Below, in the manor's approach, she could make out figures moving through the snow. 5 of them, perhaps 6, dressed in long coats that concealed something. The scent of them drifted through the manor's old stones, leather and steel and something else. Something that made the predator stirring in her chest bare its teeth. Holy water, blessed weapons, salt, vampire hunters, the Order of Mercy, Cassius said flatly. "They've been hunting me for approximately 200 years. They believe themselves righteous, believe that creatures like me are abominations that should be returned to dust." He paused. "They're not entirely wrong. Don't say that." Evangeline's hand found his, and he flinched at the contact. His skin was cold again, she realized, truly cold the way it had been before the blood bond began to warm him. He was preparing himself for violence. "What will you do? Defend the manor?" "Defend you." He turned to look at her, and his eyes had shifted again, the pupils vertical, the irises burning with an inner light. "You need to go to the crypts. There's a chamber beneath the main vault, a place of power where the original binding was cast. Nothing can touch you there, not hunters, not magic. Not even me if the hunger takes hold. I'm not leaving you. You don't have a choice in this." His voice carried an edge she'd never heard before, something old and dangerous and utterly immovable. "You're carrying my child, Evangeline. You think I would risk that? You think I would allow?" "I'm not helpless." She pulled away from him, moving toward the mirror that hung above the library's fireplace. Her reflection showed her transformation in stark relief now. Her eyes were fully luminescent, catching light that didn't exist. Her skin had taken on a marble-like quality, beautiful and alien. And beneath her surface, she could feel it, the hunger, yes, but also power. Raw, untapped power that responded to her will like a living thing. "Show me what to do, Evangeline? You said I had a choice. I'm choosing to fight." She turned to face him. "I'm choosing to stand beside you. Teach me." For a moment, he didn't respond. Then, slowly, he extended his hand. She took it, and he pulled her close, not tenderly but with urgency. His mouth found her ear. "The hunger is your greatest weapon," he whispered. "Don't fight it. Don't try to be civilized or restrained. Let it guide you. It knows what you need to survive." He pulled back slightly, meeting her luminous eyes. "If they enter this manor, if they threaten you or the child you feed, you don't hesitate, you don't question, you survive." "Understood," she nodded. Though understanding and accepting were 2 different things entirely. The first assault came through the front doors, an explosion of violence that shattered the manor's ancient peace. Evangeline felt the blow like a physical impact through the blood bond, Cassius, engaging with hunters in the entrance hall. She and Cassius moved as one now, her feet carrying her toward the conflict, while his consciousness pulled at her through their connection, trying to protect her even as she refused to be protected. She emerged into the entrance hall to find chaos. Cassius stood in the center of the room, moving with inhuman grace, his blackened armor deflecting blows from blessed swords. But he was bleeding, not from any wound the hunters had inflicted, but from the effort of restraint. His blood ran silver in the candlelight, each droplet burning where it struck the ancient stone, One of the hunters turned toward her, and she recognized the fury in his eyes. A young man, barely older than she was, with the fervent light of religious conviction burning behind his gaze. Abomination, he snarled, raising a cross carved from what looked like blessed wood. The hunger rose in Evangeline like a tidal wave. She didn't think about what she was doing. Didn't calculate or hesitate or question. She simply moved, faster than should have been possible, crossing the distance between them in a heartbeat. Her hand found his throat, and she felt him try to scream. Felt the holy symbols he wore burning against her skin, and none of it mattered because the hunger was singing now. Singing with a voice that sounded like Cassius and like Margot, and like every woman of Blackthorn who had ever existed. His blood was bitter on her tongue, corrupted by his faith, his certainty, his absolute conviction that what she was represented evil. But beneath the bitterness, there was information. Memories. She drank them down and learned that his name was Thomas, that he'd been trained since childhood to hunt creatures like Cassius, that he'd volunteered for this mission specifically because it meant a chance to end what he believed was a centuries-old scourge. When she released him, he crumpled to the ground, alive but forever changed. The blood bond would mark him now. He would spend the rest of his life carrying a connection to Evangeline, a constant reminder that his enemy had mercy when she needn't have. The other hunters froze, watching her with an entirely new species of fear in their eyes. "Leave," she said, and her voice was not her own. It was the voice of centuries, of Cassius, of Margot, of the curse itself speaking through her transformed throat. "Leave this place, and I will let you live. Return, and I will ensure you never leave again." One of them, a woman with gray threading through her dark hair, a woman who wore the insignia of a commander, stepped forward. She didn't look afraid. Instead, she looked almost sad. "You're already changing them," the woman said. "The child she carries, it will be something we've never encountered before. Something that might be worse than any curse." "Then kill me," Evangeline said flatly. "But know that if you do, Cassius will spend the next 100 years hunting every member of your order to the ends of the earth. And after that, the child will take up the hunt." The commander studied her for a long moment. Then slowly she lowered her weapon. "Fall back," she commanded her people. "We report this to the Vatican. This is beyond our authority now." They withdrew, taking the young man Thomas with them. He stared back at Evangeline as they dragged him out into the snow, confusion and violation warring in his expression. She felt a pang of something that might have been guilt, but it was overwhelmed by the satisfaction of the blood still singing through her veins. When the last of them had gone, Cassius appeared at her side. He said nothing, simply took her hand. But through the blood bond, she felt his fear, not for himself, but for what she was becoming. "I needed to survive," she said quietly. "I know." His voice was hollow. "That's what terrifies me." The letter arrived sealed in black wax. Evangeline found it on the manor's threshold on Christmas Eve, lying in fresh snow that had fallen throughout the night. The seal bore a symbol she'd come to recognize through Cassius's ancient journals, the crossed keys of the Vatican, intertwined with a sword. Her hands trembled as she broke it open. "To the bearer of the cursed blood and the prisoner of Blackthorn, the Order of Mercy has reported a new development in the matter of Cassius Valdris. A union between immortal and mortal has resulted in an unprecedented transformation. The Church declares this union heretical, and the child within the bearer's womb an abomination against God's natural law. By decree of the Pontifical Academy of Exorcism, a tribunal shall convene at Blackthorn Manor on the winter solstice of the new year. Cassius Valdris will submit to holy judgment. The bearer of his blood will be examined and, if found to be irrevocably corrupted, will be granted final mercy through consecrated flame. The child will be surrendered to the Church for study and containment. Failure to comply will result in the consecration of the manor itself and the destruction of all within it. Cardinal Matthias Crowley, Inquisitor General." Evangeline read it 3 times, each word sinking deeper into her chest like a blade. "Let me see." Cassius's voice came from behind her. She hadn't heard him approach. Daylight still lingered on the horizon, and he rarely ventured from the crypts before full dark. But he moved toward her now, his hand extended for the letter. She gave it to him and watched his face as he read. She'd learned to read him over the past weeks, to interpret the subtle shifts in his expression that betrayed emotion he'd trained himself to hide. Now, she saw something break behind his eyes. "No," she said immediately. "Whatever you're thinking, no. You don't know what I'm thinking." "I do." The blood bond carried his thoughts to her now, layered beneath the surface like sediment. She could feel his despair, his certainty that this was the end. His willingness to surrender himself to save her and the child. You're thinking you'll go to this tribunal and accept judgment. You're thinking you'll let them destroy you so that I and the baby can have a chance at something approaching a normal life. It's the only logical. It's not. She grabbed the letter from his hands and threw it into the fireplace, watching the black wax seal melt and bubble in the flames. There has to be another way. The binding, the curse, you said it could be broken. You said, not in time. His voice was hollow. The tribunal is called for 1 month hence. A month, Evangeline. Your transformation isn't complete. The child won't be born for 4 months. The blood bond hasn't yet reached the depth required to break the curse. And even if it had, the process itself takes time. Time we don't possess. She felt the truth of it through the bond and nearly wept with the weight of it. He was right. Everything in her knew he was right, but the predator in her chest, the thing she was becoming, rose up in defiance. Fight, it whispered. Survive. Consume. Then we run, she said desperately. We'll leave England. We go somewhere the church can't reach us. The curse won't allow it. Cassius moved to the window, his silhouette backlit by the dying light. I've tried, centuries ago. The binding prevents me from crossing salt water. I can move through the manor and perhaps a mile beyond its walls, but no farther. The magic that enslaved me here is too strong. Then I'll take the child and run. You won't abandon me. Not a question. A statement of fact carried through the blood bond with such certainty that she couldn't deny it. And you can't flee far enough that they won't find you. The church has resources I cannot fathom. They would hunt you forever, and the child would grow up hunted, always looking over its shoulder. Evangeline sank into a chair, her hand moving instinctively to her belly. The baby moved in response, a flutter of life that suddenly felt impossibly fragile. There has to be something. Some loophole in the binding. There is one possibility. Cassius turned from the window. His eyes were luminous now, the pupils vertical. But it requires something I've never asked of you. Anything. Don't promise that until you understand what it costs. He moved toward her and knelt before the chair, taking both her hands in his. His skin was warm now. She'd grown accustomed to that. The way her blood had transformed him from a creature of cold to something almost vital. The blood bond reaches its deepest point during the exchange of vows. A sacred ceremony, conducted in blood rather than words. If we performed it, if we bound ourselves not just through the curse, but through choice, the power generated might be enough to break the binding altogether. Then we do it. Evangeline said immediately. The ceremony requires sacrifice. His grip tightened on her hands. A willing sacrifice from the one who is human-born. In the original curse, Isabeau's father took a piece of my humanity, my ability to walk in daylight, my reflection, my connection to God and the holy places of the world. To reverse that curse, someone must offer something equally precious. She understood then what he was asking. My mortality. Not immediately. But eventually, yes. The transformation would accelerate. You would become fully as I am, immortal, bound to shadow, cut off from human society. Your child would be born already cursed, already changed. You would both exist forever in this manner, or condemned to wander forever beyond it, never able to truly belong to the mortal world again. And if I don't do this, then I face the tribunal and I die. Truly die for the first time in 4 centuries. And you and the child live, but always as hunted things. Always marked by my blood. Evangeline rose from the chair and moved toward the library's full-length mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, luminous eyes, marble skin, the faint shimmer of fangs just visible behind her lips when she smiled. She looked like something between human and monster. Beautiful and terrible. Show me the ceremony, she said. Show me what it requires. Cassius didn't move immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. You're certain? I'm certain that I love you. The words emerged from her mouth and surprised her with their absolute truth. I'm certain that this child is ours, not the church's. And I'm certain that whatever comes after, I would rather face it with you than spend eternity hiding from what we are. He rose and took her in his arms, and through the blood bond she felt his gratitude and his fear and his desperate, aching hope. We'll need to prepare, he said. The ceremony must be performed at the moment of the blood moon, 7 nights from now. We'll need to gather the tools, inscribe the sigils, prepare the altar in the crypts. Then we prepare. She pulled back to look at him. And then we fight. He kissed her then, and she tasted blood, his blood, ancient and dark and alive with centuries of longing. Through the kiss, through the blood bond, she felt the full weight of his love finally unleashed. Not hungry, not predatory, but devotional. Complete, outside. Snow continued to fall on the Yorkshire moors, and in the crypts beneath Blackthorn Manor, dormant magic stirred in anticipation of its moment of reckoning. The blood moon rose crimson and swollen over the Yorkshire moors. Evangeline had spent the past 7 days in preparation, though she barely remembered most of it. Time had become strange since the transformation accelerated, hours blurred into moments, days compressed into heartbeats. Cassius had guided her through the manor's oldest chambers, showing her texts written in languages that somehow made sense on her transformed tongue. Latin, ancient Greek, older things still, scripts that predated human civilization. They'd inscribed the crypt's altar with symbols of binding and unbinding, circles within circles, interlocking spirals. The crescent moon and thorned rose repeated in patterns that made her eyes water to contemplate. They'd gathered ingredients for the ceremony: salt from the Dead Sea, wine from the year the curse was cast, wax from candles lit at the moment of Cassius's transformation, and finally, the most precious component, a vial of Margot's blood, preserved these 2 decades since her own transformation. She knew. Cassius had whispered as he held the vial up to the light. Even as she was dying, she knew this moment would come. She prepared everything, ensured every piece would be in place. Your great-aunt was remarkable. Now, standing in the crypt dressed in garments that seemed to belong to no particular era, a gown of deep crimson silk that clung to her transformed body like liquid, Evangeline understood the full scope of Margot's love. Not just for Cassius, but for her. For the future she'd envisioned and fought to create. Are you afraid? Cassius's voice came from the shadows. She turned to find him approaching. He wore no armor now, only loose black silk that left his pale chest bare. In the light of the dozens of candles they'd arranged around the altar, he looked like something from another age entirely, a prince from a civilization long turned to dust. Terrified, she admitted. But not of you. Not of this. Of what then? Of failing. Of not being strong enough to survive the transformation. Of not being worthy of what you're offering. She paused. Of becoming something so completely other that I don't recognize myself. Cassius closed the distance between them and took her face in his hands. His thumbs traced the sharp lines of her cheekbones, bones that had become more pronounced as mortality leaked out of her. You are already unrecognizable, he said softly, and you are already worthy. The only thing left is to choose it fully. They approached the altar together. It was a simple stone platform, worn smooth by centuries of ritual. At its center lay the implements of the ceremony: 2 crystal goblets, a silver knife, and a scroll inscribed with words Evangeline couldn't quite read, but somehow understood. In the binding ceremony that cursed me, Cassius explained, taking the scroll. Isabeau's father spoke words of separation, words designed to tear me from humanity and lock me into hunger. This ceremony reverses those words. We speak them backwards, in blood rather than in air. And we bind ourselves through choice rather than through coercion. He picked up the silver knife. Its blade caught the candlelight and threw it back in shades of deep red, or perhaps that was the blood moon's influence, bleeding its color through the crypt's narrow windows. First, we acknowledge what we are, Cassius continued, not as monsters but as the truth. Say it with me. What do I say? Evangeline whispered. Your name, your nature, your choice. He extended his wrist over one of the goblets and drew the blade across his skin. His blood fell in thick droplets, steaming slightly in the cold air. It smelled like copper and roses and something else, something like starlight. If starlight had a scent, I am Cassius Valdris, he said, his voice resonating through the crypt as though the stone itself was amplifying it. I am cursed and blessed, damned and divine. I am the hunger and the restraint. I am 4 centuries of isolation and this single moment of choice. I bind myself to Evangeline Thorn through blood and will and love eternal. He extended the knife to her. Evangeline's hand trembled as she took it. Her luminous eyes found his in the candlelight. I am Evangeline Thorn, she said, surprised by the strength in her voice. I am mortal born and immortal becoming. I am the bearer of curses and the breaker of bindings. I am the mother of a future unknown and the lover of an eternal past. I bind myself to Cassius Valdris through blood and will and love eternal. She drew the blade across her wrist, and her blood, darker than it should have been, shimmering with traces of his blood already mingled with hers through the bond, fell into the second goblet. Now, Cassius whispered, we speak the reversal. Together, they lifted the scrolls and began to recite. The words came out backwards, the language inverting on their tongues. It should have been impossible, should have been unintelligible. But somehow their transformed bodies understood. Their blood understood. The very stones of the crypt seemed to understand, beginning to hum with a frequency that made Evangeline's teeth ache. The candles flared brilliant white. Evangeline gasped as she felt something shift inside her, not painful, but profound. It was as though a door that had been slowly opening suddenly swung wide. The blood bond that had thrummed through her, since the first feeding, became something else entirely. It became a cord of pure light, connecting her to Cassius across a distance that simultaneously encompassed everything and nothing. Through the bond, she felt his 4 centuries, not as a burden she had to bear, but as a gift freely offered. She experienced his centuries of isolation, the terrible, crushing weight of it, but also the moments of beauty he'd preserved. Margot's friendship. A single sunrise he'd witnessed from a window before the curse grew strong enough to burn his skin. The way moonlight sounded on certain nights when the wind was right. And underneath it all, beneath every moment of loneliness and hunger and despair, she felt what he'd been waiting for her. The knowledge, somehow imprinted on his blood across centuries, that she would come, that she would choose him, that their love would be the instrument of his salvation. "Drink," Cassius commanded gently. She lifted the goblet containing his blood and drank. It flooded through her body like liquid starlight, burning and ecstatic. Her transformation accelerated in a rush of sensation that should have been agony but instead felt like coming home. She felt her connection to daylight severing, felt the holy places of the world closing their doors to her, felt her reflection beginning to fade from mirrors. But she also felt the cage that had bound him starting to crack. When she lowered the goblet, Cassius drank from hers. She watched his face transform as her blood entered his system, saw the terrible weight of 4 centuries of isolation beginning to lift. For the first time since 1602, he looked almost free. "The binding breaks at midnight," he said hoarsely. "When the blood moon reaches its zenith, the curse will shatter. We'll be free to leave the manor. Free to choose where we go, what we become, and the tribunal." Evangeline asked, "Let them come." His eyes burned with something that was no longer hunger, but purpose. "We won't be here to receive their judgment." The candles blazed brighter, and in that light, Evangeline saw their future stretching ahead like an infinite corridor of nights and possibilities. She saw the child being born under a blood moon. She saw them running through dark forests and sleeping in crypts, and slowly, over years and decades, learning to be something entirely new. She saw, for the first time, a path that led toward something like redemption. Midnight came like a blade. Evangeline felt it the moment the blood moon reached its zenith, a violent, wrenching sensation that tore through her transformed body and sent her to her knees. Beside her, Cassius convulsed, his form flickering between solid and translucent as 4 centuries of binding magic finally reached its breaking point. The crypt began to shake. Candles flew from their sconces, their flames scattering across ancient stone. The altar cracked down its center with a sound like thunder, and the symbols they'd so carefully inscribed began to glow, first faintly, then with a brilliance that burned the eyes. Evangeline felt the manor itself responding to the breaking of the curse, felt the weight of centuries of imprisoned magic seeking release. "Hold to me," Cassius gasped, reaching for her even as his own body seemed to come apart at the seams. She grabbed his hand and felt the shock of direct contact, no longer mediated by the careful distance his hunger required. His touch no longer burned with threat. It was simply warm, simply real, simply his. The light reached a crescendo that obliterated thought, and then silence. Evangeline opened her eyes to find herself sprawled on the crypt floor, gasping for breath she no longer technically needed. Cassius lay beside her, his body still, and for a terrible moment she thought the breaking of the curse had taken him entirely. Then he sat up. "I can see my hand," he whispered, holding it up to the candlelight. In the glow, his reflection was visible, faint, but undeniably present. A shadow of the man he'd been, but real. "After 400 years I can see." He touched his own face, wonder radiating through the blood bond. "My reflection, I can see myself." "The curse," Evangeline breathed. "It's broken." "Broken," he confirmed. Then his expression changed, wariness flooding through the bond. But something else. The crypt's doors exploded inward. Figures poured through. More than Evangeline had seen in the initial assault. 24 at least, dressed in the formal vestments of Vatican exorcists, bearing weapons that blazed with holy fire. At their head walked Cardinal Matthias Crawley himself, his crimson robe seeming to drink in the candlelight, his eyes burning with the fervor of absolute certainty. "Behold, the cardinal proclaimed, his voice resonating through the crypt like judgment itself. The abomination revealed. The curse broken not through God's mercy, but through heretical covenant. The binding is dissolved, Cassius said, rising to his feet and extending a hand to help Evangeline up. His voice was different now. No longer tinged with the courtly grace of centuries past, but carrying an edge of something dangerous. By our blood and will, the injustice has been corrected. I am no longer enslaved to this place. You are enslaved to damnation, Crowley spat, and you have corrupted an innocent woman and the abomination she carries to share in your perdition. I, papal authority, I condemn you all to final mercy. Burn. The exorcists advanced, and Evangeline felt Cassius tense beside her. Through the blood bond, she sensed his calculation. They could fight, perhaps, but not win. Not here, not against this many, not with blessed weapons that would cause him genuine harm now that the curse's protection had dissolved. Run, he said quietly. What? Run, Evangeline. There's a passage behind the altar, the original way in and out of the crypt, before the binding sealed most of them. It leads to the eastern grounds. You can reach the moors. The church cannot touch you in open ground, away from the manor's walls. I'm not leaving you. You're carrying our child. His eyes met hers, and she saw the terrible calculus in them. A child that cannot be born in captivity. A child that needs to survive what comes next. Go. She wanted to refuse. Every transformed fiber of her being wanted to stand beside him and fight. But the baby, she felt the baby's distress through her own racing heartbeat, felt the small life within her responding to the violence gathering like a storm. I'll find you, she said fiercely. No matter what happens, no matter where this leads, I will find you. I know. He kissed her forehead, and she tasted blood, his blood, and through it, all the love he'd been unable to express across 4 centuries of isolation. That's why I'm not afraid. He turned to face the cardinal as Evangeline fled toward the altar. Behind her, she heard Cassius's voice rise in a language she didn't recognize, Old Romanian, perhaps, or something even older. The crypt exploded in light and sound. The passage behind the altar was narrow, barely visible until she pressed her palm against the stone. It swung open with surprising ease, revealing a tunnel that descended deeper before angling upward. Evangeline ran, her transformed body moving with inhuman speed. Her pregnancy no longer a limitation but simply a fact she carried with her. She could hear the sounds of battle echoing through the manor above, clashing metal, screams, the acrid smell of burning flesh mingled with something sweeter. Holy water hissing against vampire skin. No, she thought fiercely. Don't you dare die now. Not after 4 centuries of waiting. Not after the passage spilled her out into the snow-covered eastern gardens. The blood moon hung enormous above the moors, its crimson light painting everything in shades of scarlet and shadow. Evangeline stood gasping, looking back at the manor. Flames had begun to consume the eastern wing. No, she whispered, and the word held such raw agony that it seemed to tear something in the fabric of reality itself. The baby kicked violently in response to her distress, and Evangeline felt the blood bond suddenly strain, as though Cassius was being torn away from her across an impossible distance. She started to run back toward the manor, but a hand caught her wrist. Don't. An elderly woman stepped out of the shadows, solid, real, dressed in clothes from another century. For a moment, Evangeline didn't recognize her. Then the blood bond flickered with familiarity, and understanding struck like lightning. Margot? The manor will burn tonight, Margot said, her grip unyielding. Cassius knew this was coming. He prepared for it. But you must live. The child must live. He's dying. His transcending. Margot's eyes, so similar to Evangeline's own luminous gaze, held centuries of knowledge. The curse bound him to the manor. Now that it's broken, he exists independent of this place. But the transformation, it will take him time to fully integrate what he's become. Where is he? Evangeline demanded. Everywhere and nowhere, Margot said cryptically. The blood bond connects you. In time you'll understand. But for now you must go. The church will search for you. They'll hunt the child relentlessly because they fear what it represents. A being born of 2 natures, capable of transcending the limitations that bind either parent. She pulled Evangeline toward the moors, away from the burning manor. When will I see him again? Evangeline cried, looking back as flames consumed centuries of history. When the child is born, Margot said. When new blood enters the world and calls to the old. When midnight falls on the spring equinox, and the veil between worlds grows thin enough for the cursed and the blessed to meet in the space between. That's 3 months away. 3 months for you to learn what you've become, Margot replied. 3 months for Cassius to remember what it means to be free. 3 months for the child to grow strong enough to survive a birth that will rewrite everything we understand about immortality. They crested a hill, and Evangeline looked back one final time. Blackthorn Manor was fully engulfed now, a beacon of destruction against the blood moon. But through the flames, through the distance, she felt Cassius's presence in the bond, not fading, but transforming, not an ending. A becoming. 3 months of running. Evangeline had lost count of the safe houses. The sympathetic mortals who harbored them without truly understanding what they harbored. The narrow escapes from church hunters, who seemed to multiply like locusts across England. Margot had guided her, always from a distance, always appearing in mirrors or in the space between waking and dreams, providing directions and warnings. Now, in a cottage on the Scottish border, as spring equinox approached and her belly had grown so large that she could barely move, Evangeline understood the true weight of her choice. She was caught between two worlds entirely. Not quite vampire, her reflection remained visible in mirrors, though increasingly faint. Not quite human, she required blood now. Though not as desperately as Cassius did. The pregnancy had become a strange oscillation between her two natures, the child within her feeding on both her blood and the ambient magic that clung to her transformed flesh. The midwife Margot had arranged for her was no ordinary woman. Helen carried the faint luminescence of someone who'd been touched by immortal blood, though whether through love or feeding or some older covenant, Evangeline never learned to ask. She simply appeared each evening to monitor the pregnancy and offer cryptic observations. "The child is nearly ready," Helen said on the evening of the equinox, her weathered hands pressing against Evangeline's belly. "Can you feel it? The way it's turned, seeking the threshold between worlds." "I feel everything," Evangeline whispered. Her body had become a battleground between two natures. Pain and ecstasy warred beneath her skin with each contraction. Labor that was beginning, she sensed, far earlier than it should have. "I feel him everywhere. Through the bond, like he's trying to reach me across some impossible distance. Because he is." Helen moved to the window, gazing out at the Scottish landscape where mist clung to the hills like ghost breath. The curse's breaking didn't just free him from the manor, child. It fragmented him across the spaces between. He exists now in the crypt where he was bound, in the ashes of Blackthorn Manor where he fell, in every shadow cast by the blood moon, and most importantly, Helen turned back to face her. He exists within you, within the bond. The only way for him to become whole is to anchor himself to the moment of the child's birth. "Will he survive it?" Evangeline asked, terror and hope warring in her chest. "Neither of you will be the same," Helen replied. "But yes, you'll all survive. The question is what you'll become in the surviving." The labor began in earnest as midnight approached. Evangeline had read about childbirth in medical texts before everything changed, had listened to her sister's horror stories about pain and blood, and the body becoming something alien to itself. But nothing had prepared her for this. This was not simply biological process. This was metaphysical rupture. With each contraction, she felt the boundaries of her body becoming permeable. The child was not simply pushing outward, it was pulling at the fabric of reality itself, calling to its father across the spaces that separated them. And Cassius was answering. She saw him first in the mirror above the cottage's hearth. Not a reflection exactly, but a presence. A shadow, shape that coalesced into something approaching human form. His face was indistinct, flickering like candlelight, but his eyes burned with such intensity that she could feel their focus like a physical touch. "I'm here," he said, and his voice came from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. "I'm anchoring. Hold to me, Evangeline. Hold to the bond. It hurts," she gasped, her body convulsing with another contraction. "Everything hurts and I can feel you fragmenting. Then call me back," he commanded. "Use the blood. Use the child. Use whatever power you possess to make me whole. I cannot do this alone, but together." Evangeline's hand shot out, grabbing Helen's wrist. "Blood," she whispered. "I need." Helen extended her arm without hesitation. Evangeline's fangs descended, fully now, no longer hidden or restrained, and she fed. The blood that filled her mouth was warm and willing, and layered with centuries of memory. Through it, she tasted Margot's sacrifice. The weight of generations of women who'd carried the secret of Blackthorn's curse, the love they'd all poured into ensuring this moment would arrive. The power that flowed through her was immeasurable. She felt herself expand beyond the boundaries of her physical form. Felt her consciousness reaching out through the blood bond, grasping for Cassius across the fractured space that contained him. She pulled him toward her through sheer will, drawing his scattered essence back into something resembling coherence. "Come," she cried out, her voice resonating with power that made the cottage's walls tremble. "Come home. Come to your child. Come to me." The mirror shattered. Cassius materialized at the foot of her bed, fully solid, fully present. He looked different than before, older somehow, despite his young face. He wore the weight of his 4 centuries visibly now, and his eyes held knowledge that seemed to encompass eternities. His clothes were tattered, burned away in the manor's destruction, and his pale skin was marked with scars that hadn't existed before. "I'm here," he said, his voice wonderfully, impossibly real. "I've always been here. I'll always be here." The final contractions came in a rush of power and agony and transcendence. Evangeline felt the child moving toward the threshold of the world, felt the moment when it took its first breath, and knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same. The infant emerged into Cassius's waiting hands, and for a moment, there was only silence. The child was beautiful in a way that made Evangeline's transformed heart ache. It had her dark eyes and Cassius's pale skin, and when it opened its mouth to cry, 2 small fangs were visible. The cry itself seemed to resonate through multiple dimensions simultaneously, a sound that belonged to no single world. "Our daughter," Cassius whispered, tears streaming down his face as he placed the child against Evangeline's chest. "We have a daughter." Evangeline looked down at the small, perfect creature that had emerged from her body and felt something shift fundamentally in her soul. This was the breaking point. This was where everything converged, curse and blessing, mortality and immortality, damnation and redemption. "She's perfect," she breathed. "She's ours," Cassius corrected, and through the blood bond, she felt the absolute truth of it. The child had anchored him, had given him a purpose beyond survival. And in that moment, bound together by blood and choice and the terrible, beautiful reality of their love, they became something entirely new, not cursed, not blessed, something beyond both categories, a family, finally impossibly a family. Helen moved about the cottage, cleaning away the evidence of birth while outside, the spring equinox moon rose over the Scottish hills. It was neither blood red nor silver, but something in between, a color that had never existed before and would never exist again. "What do we call her?" Evangeline asked, looking at the small creature who slept against her transformed heart, a creature born of curse and covenant and eternal love. Cassius considered this, his hand gentle on the baby's impossibly small face. "Seraph," he said finally, "because she is the bridge between heaven and hell, and she burns with the light of both." The hunters came on the 7th night after Seraph's birth. Evangeline sensed them first through the blood bond, not as distinct individuals, but as a wave of hostile intention crashing against her consciousness. She was nursing Seraph in the cottage's main room, the child feeding with a hunger that seemed insatiable, when Cassius stiffened beside her. "How many?" she asked quietly, more than before. His eyes had taken on that predatory gleam again, but tempered now with something protective. He'd learned restraint in his fragmented months, she realized, or perhaps fatherhood had taught him what isolation never could. And they're carrying something different. Not blessed weapons. Something older. Older than the church itself. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Cassius said, moving toward the window, "that they've brought a counter-covenant. A binding spell designed to trap immortals in a state between life and death. I recognize the magic signature. It's the same sorcery used to curse me in the first place." Evangeline's blood ran cold. She looked down at Seraph, who had finished feeding and now slept against her breast, perfectly content and utterly vulnerable. "They mean to trap you. To separate, not just me." Cassius's voice held a terrible certainty. "Seraph, they believe the child is the key to understanding immortality. If they can contain her, study her, they might develop weapons that could destroy every vampire on Earth. She represents a threat to their worldview in ways I never could. Then we run again," Evangeline said, rising carefully, cradling Seraph against her chest. "We take what we need and disappear into. There's nowhere left to run." The sadness in his voice broke something inside her. The church has resources we can't escape, hunters in every country, allies in every nation. And Seraph, she draws attention now that she's been born. The blood calls to the blood. Evangeline, every immortal being for 1,000 miles can sense her. It's only a matter of time before others come, drawn by curiosity or hunger, or the desire to control what she might become. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying we stop running." He turned to face her, and she saw the resolve in his eyes, not despair, but a terrible, beautiful determination. "I'm saying we make our stand here now. Tonight, with a newborn. Her voice rose in pitch. Cassius, she's barely a week old, which is why the blood bond must be completed between you and me before they arrive. He moved toward her, extending his hand. A full binding ceremony, not the tentative union we created to break the curse. A binding so deep that your power will be indistinguishable from mine, and my immortality will be anchored not just to you, but to Seraph as well. It will create a protection, not perfect, but enough that they cannot simply take her. Evangeline understood what he was asking. A complete merging of their essences, a loss of the last remnants of her individual identity. A choice that would bind her eternally to this man. This place, this impossible situation, and if I refuse, then I face them alone, and you take Seraph and run one final time. He said it without inflection, but through the blood bond, she felt the cost of that statement. I would rather you chose to stand with me. I would rather our daughter grow up knowing her parents' love was absolute enough to transform the very nature of immortality. But I will not force that choice upon you. You've been forced enough. Evangeline looked down at Seraph, who slept with absolute trust in her arms. She thought of Margot, who'd spent a lifetime preparing for this moment. She thought of all the women of Blackthorn who'd carried the secret, maintained the covenant, ensured that when the time came, there would be a way forward. And she thought of Cassius, not the monster, not the curse, but the man beneath. 4 centuries of isolation, and he'd used his freedom to become a father. To choose love over hunger, to stand before the forces arrayed against them with nothing but his determination and his hope. Show me the binding, she said. They had no time for elaborate preparation. The hunters were perhaps an hour away. She could feel them approaching through the night like a tide of ice. Cassius used his own blood to inscribe symbols on the cottage's floor. Faster now, more efficient, his centuries of practice distilled into pure purpose. He held out his wrist to her. Drink deeply, he commanded. Take all of me that you can hold. Merge your essence with mine until we are no longer two but one. She drank. His blood was different now than it had been before, not corrupted by centuries of isolation, but refined by them. Each memory she tasted carried weight the moment he'd first seen her emerge from the crypt, every touch they'd shared. The instant Seraph had been born and he'd felt his fragmented self become whole again. But underneath those recent memories lay older things. The original curse, tasted through his blood as it was being cast. The moment of Isabeau's betrayal. 300 years of solitary darkness punctuated by Margot's visits. 4 centuries of waiting for someone who could break the binding not through power, but through choice. When she lowered his wrist, Evangeline felt the merging complete. She was no longer entirely herself, but she was not entirely him either. They existed in a state of perfect balance, 2 consciousnesses occupying one transformed body. One will express through multiple forms. Now, Cassius's voice and her own spoke simultaneously. We protect what is ours. The cottage door exploded inward. Cardinal Crowley stood at the threshold, his crimson robes pristine despite the night's journey. Behind him, 24 exorcists carried a massive silver frame inscribed with symbols that made Evangeline's transformed senses scream in protest. The counter, Covenant, a binding spell designed to trap immortals in suspended animation. Surrender the abomination, Crowley commanded, and we will grant you mercy. A quick death instead of eternal torment. Evangeline and Cassius smiled, and in that smile lived 4 centuries of defiance. The only abomination here, they said, is the Church's inability to accept that love transcends the boundaries you've tried to impose. That covenant means something deeper than your doctrine. That a curse can become a blessing if those bound by it choose transformation. Power erupted from them like a star-going supernova. The blood bond, now complete and absolute, manifested as visible force, a wave of dark energy that slammed into the hunters and sent them flying backward. But Evangeline felt no triumph in it. Instead, she felt the cost. Each use of this power drained something from her, from Cassius, from the very foundation of their merged consciousness. They couldn't sustain this. Not forever. Not against the Church's resources and determination. But they could sustain it long enough. Seraph, sensing her parents' desperation and their fierce, absolute love, began to cry. And when she cried, something changed in the air around the cottage. A shift in reality itself. The blood moon, which had been waning, suddenly brightened. The very fabric of existence seemed to ripple in response to the child's voice. The hunters fell back, confusion and fear warring in their faces. Because they could feel it too, the emergence of something entirely new. Something that belonged to neither heaven nor hell, but to the space between. something that would require entirely new doctrine, entirely new understanding of what immortality could mean. She calls to something ancient? One of the exorcists whispered. Something that predates the church itself. Cardinal Crawley's face went pale. Fall back, he commanded. We return to Rome. This matter requires higher authority than mine. As the hunters retreated into the night, Evangeline felt Cassius's consciousness merge more fully with her own. They were becoming something singular now, two wills slowly fusing into one eternal purpose. Is this the end? She wondered aloud. No, Cassius replied through her own voice. This is only the beginning. 6 months passed in a state of strange suspension. The cottage on the Scottish border became a sanctuary, not through any magic Cassius or Evangeline consciously created, but through Seraph herself. The child grew at an accelerated pace, her small form transforming visibly week by week. By 3 months old, she possessed the physical appearance of a 6-month-old infant, and her consciousness rippled outward with a power that made even Cassius careful in her presence. The blood bond between Evangeline and Cassius had stabilized into something neither of them fully understood. They remained two distinct consciousnesses, but increasingly intertwined. Some days, Evangeline could feel his thoughts as clearly as her own. Other days, she would find herself speaking in his voice, moving with his centuries of grace, remembering moments she'd never lived. Most strangely, she discovered she no longer aged. Not just slowly, not at all. Her body had locked into perfect stasis, caught at the moment of Seraph's birth. The transformation was complete. Are you afraid? Cassius asked her one evening as they sat before the cottage's hearth, watching Seraph sleep in her cradle. The child's skin shimmered faintly in the firelight, and her fangs, 2 small pearls of ivory, caught the glow. Off what? Evangeline replied, though she knew exactly what he meant. Off what comes next. Of forever. She considered this. Once, the thought of eternity would have terrified her. But now, bound to Cassius through blood and choice and the terrible, beautiful miracle of their daughter, forever seemed almost manageable. I'm afraid of the church coming back, she admitted. I'm afraid of hunters and trials and a world that will never accept what we are. But I'm not afraid of forever. Not with you. Not with her. Cassius took her hand, and through the blood bond, she felt his relief and his fear. Because he carried knowledge she didn't, memories that predated her by centuries. He knew that immortality was not a gift, but a curse dressed in attractive clothing. That forever was long enough to watch everyone you loved turn to dust. Long enough to forget who you were. Long enough to become a monster in truth, not just in designation. There's something you need to understand about Seraph, he said quietly. About what she is, and what she's going to become. Tell me. She's not vampire, not entirely, and she's not human either. He paused, gathering words the way one might gather stones to build a bridge across an impossible chasm. The covenant the church tried to invoke, it triggered something in her blood, a recognition of old magic. Ancient magic. She carries within her the capacity to become what I was never designed to be, a bridge between the cursed and the blessed, between immortality and mortality, between the natural world and the supernatural one. You're saying she can break the divide between our worlds, Evangeline whispered. I'm saying she has the potential to remake it entirely. Cassius's eyes held centuries of consequence. The church didn't retreat because they were afraid of us, Evangeline. They retreated because they sensed what Seraph represents, the end of the binary that has defined supernatural conflict for millennia. She is the proof that curse and blessing are not opposites, but complementary forces. She is the living evidence that the old doctrine has failed. What happens when Rome realizes that? They'll send someone more dangerous than hunters or exorcists. He stood, moving to the window. Outside, the Scottish moors stretched endlessly beneath a sky that held no stars. They'll send a theologian. Someone whose weapon is not steel or holy water, but belief itself. Someone capable of reframing what Seraph represents in ways that will turn her into a tool rather than a liberated being. As if in response to his words, Seraph woke. She didn't cry or fuss. She simply opened her eyes, luminous, ancient, and terrifyingly aware for a 6-month-old who should have possessed the consciousness of an infant. Her gaze found Cassius, then Evangeline, and in that moment, both parents felt the weight of what they'd created. Seraph sat up in her cradle with movements too coordinated for her apparent age. When she spoke, her voice was strange, layered, as though multiple versions of herself were speaking simultaneously. I understand now, she said. I understand what I am, what you are, what the world cannot yet comprehend. Evangeline and Cassius exchanged a look through the blood bond. How is this possible? Evangeline asked aloud. Because I was born in the space between. Seraph replied calmly. Born at the moment when the blood moon reached its zenith, and the church's magic clashed with yours. I didn't grow in time the way you did, Mother. I grew in the spaces between moments, in the gaps that exist when old magic confronts new reality. She rose from her cradle with fluid grace and moved toward them. At 6 months old, she possessed the height and coordination of a 2-year-old, but her face held an agilousness that suggested something far more ancient. The church will come for me, Seraph continued. They will try to contain me, study me, eventually destroy me if they decide I represent too great a threat to their doctrine. And they may succeed, because I am not invulnerable. But before they try, we need to establish the terms of what comes next. You speak as though you're already considering your own fate, Cassius said, wonder and sorrow warring in his voice. Because I am. Seraph took both their hands, and where she touched them, Evangeline felt the blood bond shimmer and reorganize. It was no longer a connection between two immortals and their child. It was becoming something multidirectional, branching outward like roots seeking soil. I've been thinking about the women of Blackthorn. About Margot, and all those who came before her. They maintained the covenant for 400 years, knowing that the breaking of it would result in something entirely new. They weren't trying to save you, Father. They were trying to birth me. That's not possible, Evangeline whispered. Margot died decades before we, did she? Seraph's eyes held a sadness that belonged to no child. Or did she simply transform into a state we don't yet have language for? The women of Blackthorn carried the knowledge across generations. They passed it through blood and bone and the deep architecture of curse, magic itself. They knew that when a cursed immortal and a bloodline bearer joined in willing covenant, their daughter would emerge as something unprecedented. She released their hands and moved toward the window. I can feel them, she said softly. All of them. Margot, and the generations before her, echoing through my blood. They're waiting to see what I'll do with this inheritance. What will you do? Cassius asked. Seraph turned to face them, and for just a moment, her appearance shifted. She looked simultaneously as she was now, as she would be at 20, at 50, at 100. She was showing them her potential, the infinite possibility she carried. I will go to Rome, she said. I will stand before the cardinal and the pope and the highest authorities of the church, and I will tell them a story. A true story not of damnation, but of transformation. I will show them that curse and blessing are not absolutes, but states of consciousness. That immortality is not punishment but possibility. That love, true love, chosen love, sacrifice, born love, is the only power in this universe that can reshape reality itself. They'll never believe you, Evangeline said. No, Seraph agreed. Most won't. But some will, and that's enough. Because belief, once it takes root, spreads like blood through veins. It carries itself forward. It transforms everything it touches. She moved between them and took their hands again. You broke the curse, Father. You chose transformation, Mother. But I will break the cycle that created the curse in the first place. I will reshape what it means to be damned or blessed. I will make it so that future generations of immortals are not hunted, but understood, not feared, but recognized for what they truly are, proof that reality is more complicated and beautiful than any doctrine can contain. Evangeline felt tears on her face, impossible tears, because she shouldn't have been able to cry anymore. But Seraph was making her possible in ways she'd never imagined. When do you leave? Cassius asked quietly. Tonight, Seraph said. While the moon is dark when the veil between worlds is thinnest, but before I go, I need you both to understand something. The blood bond between you. It was never meant to be temporary. It was designed to persist beyond this moment, beyond even the possibility of your individual deaths. You are bound eternally, not just to each other, but to the work of reshaping the world's understanding of what immortality means. She kissed her father's forehead, then her mother's. Where her lips touched their skin, they felt the blood bond transform again, no longer a chain but a purpose. A mission that would span centuries. I will return to you, Seraph said. When the work is complete, when the world has been reshaped enough that a cursed vampire lord and his transformed wife and their impossible daughter can walk freely under any sky. When that day comes, we'll build something together. A family, a legacy, a new kind of immortality. She walked toward the door, and as she did, the cottage began to glow with light that came from no source. The blood bond pulsed outward, touching every immortal being within 1,000 miles, carrying her message: the curse is ending. The transformation is beginning. Join us, or resist us. But know that change is coming. By the time she disappeared into the Scottish night, Evangeline and Cassius understood the truth. They had broken a curse. But their daughter had done something far more radical. She'd made the very concept of curses obsolete. And in doing so, she'd given them something neither of them expected to find after centuries of darkness: hope.